Welcome again to Empathy Month 2024. Just as a reminder, Empathy Month was inspired by Empathy Lab UK's Empathy Day, which focused on teaching school-age kids about empathy. Delilah Brown created Empathy Month USA to help adults engage with empathy over a series of sessions throughout this month with speakers from all different perspectives sharing how they use empathy in their everyday lives. So, again, really glad you're here to celebrate this month with us. And now I want to turn to my session, which is called Restored Empathy and Restorative Justice Getting Ready to Do Sorry. And this session is about how I use empathy in my work as a restorative justice facilitator. So, let's get into it. Today, we're going to obviously talk about restorative justice, what it is, and then move into empathy, and finally weave together empathy and restorative justice, and then talk about how we use empathy to help prepare people to do sorry. That it's no longer just about saying sorry, but also about doing sorry. So before I dug too deep into the content, I wanted to just introduce myself. My name is Kendra Spilar. I use she, her pronouns, and I am on the lands of the Potawatomi. I am also the founder of Restore Resolutions, LLC. Restore provides conflict resolution services using restorative justice, which is a relational approach to conflict, right? And again, we're going to dive deeper into that as we move forward into today's session. I work with K through 12s, colleges, universities, people in the criminal system, people at churches, and in other workplaces across the country. I am also a certified connection practice coach, trainer, and curriculum instructor. And many of the session hosts you'll hear are also connection practice coaches or trainers. And so I want to explain just a little bit about the connection practice in case you don't happen to catch all of their sessions. In short, it is a beautiful practice that uses empathy plus insight to get to connection, whether it's connection to self or connection to others. I am also a certified restorative justice facilitator, a licensed attorney, and I have completed a 32-hour training offered by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on how to conduct EEOC investigations. I'm also a certified women-owned business enterprise, and I am a registered federal contractor as well. So, as you heard, I have spent over 22 years amassing some external evidence of my worth and of the stuff I've been doing in the world, including a picture here of me with some writing that shows I've been doing stuff, like really important stuff. But I think the thing I am most proud of, I can't have framed, right? Can't. It's not a diploma and it's not a certificate. It's really the inner work of facing, getting to know, and starting to really love who I am. And it's really that work that moved me from being in a compliance, punishment focused approach to conflict to a restorative approach to conflict. I get to be present, stay engaged, and approach what are really difficult things with curiosity and kindness. And that just fills me with so much joy. And also to see people be so responsive to it. You know, as I was trying to frame this transition that I'd made, um, I was I was writing a piece or a contribution in a book that you'll see on that one of these pages here. Um, and my then 9-year-old daughter walked into where I was, and she was like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I told her my challenge, and she's like, "Mom," she's like, "You made this change because you wanted things to change. And she was referencing how I wanted things to change in the compliance world, right? And I kind of turned my whole body towards her and I smiled, which was encouraging to her. So she continued and she said, "You wanted people to feel better." And then she kind of just added off the cuff, she goes, "And you seem happier." And when I told her I was going to kind of begin my piece with our conversation, she was like, "Make sure you cite me." So, Georgia, here's your citation. And thank you for saying so beautifully what I was struggling with, because she was absolutely right. I wanted to do work more aligned with what was on my insides, which, and what I care about, which is repair, growth, healing, and connection. And that's what I get to do now. So now I want to shift gears and talk more specifically about restorative justice. What you'll see here on this slide is a definition of restorative justice by Howard Zehr. And Howard Zehr didn't create restorative justice. In fact, it's been around for hundreds of years and originated in indigenous nations. But Howard Zehr really brought focus and attention and awareness to it in the West, basically introduced it to the West. And he says that restorative justice requires, at minimum, that we address the harms and needs of those harmed, hold those causing harm accountable to put right those harms, and involve both these parties, the harmed and the person who's caused the harm, as well as relevant community members in this process. So this definition has three basic pieces. One is that we are going to identify, focus in on, and address the harms and needs of the people who were harmed. He has explained that when people and relationships are harmed, needs are created. And so we need to center on the harms and needs of the people who are hurt, which means that we got to know what those harms and needs are. The challenge is, and what I have found in working with folks, is that many people don't have a language for their needs. And that's why often I begin the process by teaching them the language of feelings and needs. And that's why the connection practice and its focus on empathy is so important, because it has a strategy or an approach to teach people how to name their own feelings and unmet needs. And it emphasizes that really feelings are a message about met and unmet needs. And so by practicing with the connection practice, people are able to get at really difficult things, be able to name them, and then get those needs met. The second part of the definition is accountability, right? That those who cause the harm put right those harms. And really, the heart of the obligation is to put the right the harms, and that doing so is what justice is. That the person who's caused harm becomes accountable and makes things as right as they can. What I am seeing for those who caused harm is that hurt people. And if we don't address the hurt that they've experienced, that they don't have the capacity to start to understand the hurt they've caused. And so here again, by naming their feelings and needs, they can give themselves empathy and they can learn that language. And they feel seen and heard. And from that place of empowered, they feel like they have the power to make things right for someone else. And they have the capacity to hear what's needed to make it right. Finally, both parties and relevant community members are involved in the process. An aspect of this is that both parties volunteer to enter into this. No one forces them to do so, right? And that once they are in the process, that really the answer or the outcome is defined by things that they recommend and suggest. And oftentimes, community members can be impacted by the behavior and issue. For example, a lot of times when I'm working with younger kids, it's their parents who are involved in the process, and they have a lot of amazing observations and ways that they've been impacted that get factored in to the outcome that's created by the participants. Another way to explain restorative justice is to say what it isn't. And so this slide highlights kind of the other option for conflict resolution, which is a more punitive approach. And this is the far more common way that we are responding to harm or to conflict. The punitive approach is often what we think of when we think of like investigations or criminal prosecutions. And really, it is focused on the institution having power over someone who has hurt another person or caused harm. The focus is on what rules have been broken, the fact that violations of those rules create guilt, and how justice requires that the institution determine guilt and to impose punishment. It asks what laws have been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve. And the value at issue is that offenders should get what they deserve. Um, I have worked in so many different institutions over these last few decades. I've been an assistant prosecuting attorney. I have been a civil rights investigator, a deputy Title IX coordinator, as well as even a hearing officer. And toward the end of my time at a large public institution, I had a case in which a first-year student, a Black man, was accused of sexually assaulting another first-year student who was a white woman. The details were nuanced, confusing, as most of these matters are, and so they take time to gather information about. In our first meeting, a young man came on screen, took one look at me, and told me I wasn't going to be fair to him, and that most Black men get accused of things that they didn't do, and that the system was going to take him down. I could see his fear and his anger, and I didn't argue with him. I just acknowledged what he was saying. And then I said all the things you say to try to reassure somebody you're going to be fair and impartial. But frankly, that isn't comforting to someone who's lived experiences point to another truth, which is that Black people, especially Black men, when accused of a white woman, are not treated fairly in the criminal system, in the student conduct system, or frankly in any U.S. system. And there's lots of empirical data collected on this that makes this kind of undeniable right at this point. And in these investigations, we usually begin with telling the respondent what's been reported about them. So right off the bat, they're put in a position to have to respond to what's already been said about them, which inherently puts them in a defensive position. And it takes the narrative of what happened out of their hands. So as I mentioned, this investigation took some time. And each time I met with this young man, he shared more and more about his life. He shared that he was the first person to go in his family to go to college, that he couldn't tell his parents about what was happening because they had too much to deal with already. And then one day, I got a call from him, and he told me he was going to kill himself. He told me how he was going to do it. He told me when, he told me where. He had said, he tried counseling services that were offered to him, but they didn't really get what he was going through, or at least he didn't feel comfortable telling them all of the things that factored into how he was feeling. We'd connected him to mentors, but they were focused on keeping him in school. They didn't quite get that he was a whole person who had, many different connections to what was happening. And he didn't feel like they had helped him. And so for him, he was in this place of desperation, right? It was like an all or nothing situation, and he couldn't see his way out. And I think Those are the dangerous limits of a system that relies first on focusing on what rules were broken, whether he did it, and what he deserved. I don't know the outcome of that case, but I do know that he ultimately got the support that he needed. And one of the things I'm never going to forget about the conversation with him was really feeling his desperation and just wanting to comfort him and to end his suffering in some way, right? Instead, what I told him, and I'll tell you, I think I would have been fired had my supervisors known this. I told him, you matter. In fact, you matter to me, and you are needed in this world. He was and is a person who deserves to have their sacred dignity acknowledged no matter what the situation is, as was the other person involved in this matter. But I think in that punitive system, where so many assumptions are made from the outset, there isn't a lot of room for that. And I think moving through a process, trusting yourself or others in that process is really hard when you've experienced, a world of judgment, shame, criticism, and even violence for being who you are, right? And you might come to believe that harm and violence, whether to yourself or others, are your best tools to be seen and to survive. I think it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to extend grace to another person if it's never been extended to you or you've never received it. I think you'd also feel defensive if you're in a process that doesn't really see or hear who you are, where you've got people who've been trained, right, to really turn over some negative assumptions about you over and over and over again, maybe because of your race, your national origin, your ethnicity, your sex, who you love, your ability, your veteran status, or even your age. You might feel trapped. You might feel like you have to take drastic actions to be really seen and heard or protect yourself. And this is where I think empathy and restorative justice can really turn the tide, where we can start to move from violence to really learn some new tools and skills to address harm. Because what if, instead of asking who broke the rules and what do they deserve, what if we instead shifted our focus to seeing the conflict or the harm as a violation of a relationship between people who have inherent value, where we're asking who's been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? Because that's what the restorative process is about. For the restorative process, accountability is about repair and making things right. It's where the institution gives their power to come alongside with those participants in the process. It values the victim's needs and the offender taking responsibility and making things as right as possible. It asks who's been harmed, what are the needs, and whose obligations is it to meet those needs. Each participant is given a chance to be seen and heard, and in essence, to be extended empathy, so that real healing and repair work can begin. And I'll tell you, when you compare these two processes, when kind of studies have been done, what they're finding is that when a restorative process is used, whether in addition to a punitive process or standing alone, that recidivism is reduced by 45%. It cut the cost of addressing conflict from anywhere from $8,000 to $35,000. And the participants, those people who have been harmed and the people who have caused harm, have an 80 to 90% satisfaction rate with the outcome, which is huge. It's absolutely huge. Now I want to get a little bit more granular with how we use empathy. Empathy, I think, can get confused with a lot of different definitions. So I want to just do a quick compare contrast. So empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is understanding what another person is feeling, right? Even if you haven't had the experience that the other person has had. So, for example, it can look like feeling sad for someone who's living in a war zone, even though you don't live in one. You feel something in response to the trigger of someone else's suffering. Whereas empathy is the ability to understand another person's feelings by relating to their experience and considering their point of view. And it looks like listening to someone without judgment, right? You are feeling with them and you are understanding their feelings, especially ones that are different from your own, with a sense of curiosity about their viewpoint. And the purpose is to better understand them, right? So, in addition to the trigger of seeing their suffering, you feel with them and you try to understand those feelings. Whereas compassion has a lot of elements of empathy. So, all those same elements, the trigger of seeing someone suffer, that you feel with them, and that you try to understand how someone else is feeling. But it adds that step of taking action to help end the suffering. You stay calm, consistent, and centered and confident as you offer that help with compassion. There are also different types of empathy: cognitive, affective, and compassionate. So, with cognitive empathy, that's the ability to understand another person's thoughts and beliefs and perspectives without kind of entering into their emotional experience. And often this is the type of empathy I was encouraged to have when working as an investigator, so I could, identify support resources for people. Um, and for someone who is trying to understand another person's suffering, especially someone who's caused harm, usually this is like the first step, right? It's just acknowledging that the other person has suffered, that they can intellectually acknowledge that, right? And that their actions might have caused that suffering, or an action caused another person to suffer. Affective empathy is the ability to share in and understand the emotional experiences and feelings of others, right? So as people start to move from getting that suffering has occurred and that an action caused that suffering, and that intellectually they can understand that, and as they learn the language of feelings and needs, they can start to understand how someone might have felt if they had experienced that kind of harm. And it can lead to feeling the same or similar feelings as that other person. And it can also start to grow a feeling of concern for them, right? When they consider that struggle. There's a great example of this on the Empathy Month YouTube channel. Brene Brown did a beautiful kind of cartoon illustration of how this might work. And then finally, compassionate empathy is going beyond sharing one's emotions to also experiencing a desire to help and support someone who's suffering. So it involves taking a proactive step to kind of support or comfort someone. An example might be, you might make meals for someone who's lost a loved one. But in the context of restorative justice, this looks like doing the repair work, right? After learning the cognitive piece, feeling with somebody and understanding the suffering from that emotional standpoint, moving from that place into informed action, and informed by not only the cognitive, but also the feeling with somebody. That's when you can start to get really meaningful repair work. A few years ago, I worked with a Black female student, a third-year student, who reported that a white first-year student had sexually assaulted her. The students have requested a restorative process after first having gone through months and months of an investigation. They were told at the outset that the focus of our work wouldn't result in a finding of responsible or not responsible, and that they could choose to stop our work at any time. So we first began by meeting separately, and I had asked them, some of the classic restorative justice questions like what happened, who was affected, and how, and what was needed to make things right. Then in the second set of meetings, um, I led them through the connection practice where they were able, or at least they were invited, to name the moment when they felt the most concentrated negative feeling, right, about what had happened. And then they were to name their feelings and unmet needs around that moment. And then they were asked to respectfully guess the other person's feelings and unmet needs. And moving through those two pieces, they were able to give themselves empathy, and they were able to at least start to consider what the other person might have been experiencing. They were led then through something called the quick coherence technique, which I think Delilah is going to get into later this month. And they were asked what insights came out of kind of turning inside and considering what they had learned about themselves and guessed about the other person. And so after leading these separate sessions, um, the young man was invited to share some of his kind of thoughts, beliefs, emotional experiences, and feelings. Um, and so, really getting at the cognitive and affective empathy aspects. And then, when he was asked to kind of respectfully guess um, what the young woman had felt, again, we were just continuing to refine those affective elements of empathy. And what I learned about him was that just a few weeks before the reported incident, he had very suddenly lost his dad. And he had lots of feelings tied up into that loss. He didn't have a positive relationship with his dad, and he had so many, conflicting feelings. And because it was so disconcerting to him, he started to self medicate with a lot of alcohol. And on the night in issue, he had drank a lot of alcohol. And there were also pieces of what happened that the young woman couldn't remember because she had also had some alcohol. And he had shared that he tried to call EMS to help her because at some point he realized she was not conscious. Um, and so, in talking with the young woman, what became clear and what would not have become clear in an investigation is that one of the things that she was most hurt by was the fact that he denied in any wrongdoing and that he actively tried to tear down her reputation. She was one of very few Black students at this institution, and she was painted as somebody who was sexually promiscuous and often confused with a woman who was a young Black woman who was more sexually active. And the fact that they shared some friends and that they were both athletes and both had experienced kind of relationships in which sides were being chosen led her to feel extremely isolated. And so when the two were finally able to come together, one of the things that came out of the ask was, it's something that he readily agreed to do, was for him to clarify um, that he had responsibility in what happened, and that made a really significant difference to her. That he was willing to engage in the hard work of coming to terms with the fact that he had harmed her. And so you can see there's a very different outcome when it's approached from a punitive lens versus a restorative lens. This is an example of a connection practice board and how feelings can be and needs can be drawn over and considered. And there's also a space to note shared feelings and shared needs. And what I have found is that there are many times where the participants have similar feelings and needs. The other thing I guess I wanted to note about the dramatic difference between how the first instance of sexual assault was handled and the second instance of sexual assault was handled was that the young white man in the second case had an attorney, felt like he could tell his parents about what was happening, and he used his positionality as a team member to get the support of his friends, right? Whereas, the young black man in the first instance didn't have those financial or societal resources to access, and he was subject to the university's conduct system in a more punitive way. And it's why the data supporting the use of restorative justice as kind of a default way to handle conflict. Um, Studies have shown that using restorative justice um, infuses these systems with far more equity than they've had before, especially when applied to people who have been over-monitored, punished far more harshly, and whose voices and experiences have been consistently marginalized. Again, for someone who's been hurt over and over again and is now hurting others because the pain's too big to contain, when we begin to see them, hear them, understand their lived experiences that have shaped them, we begin to understand who they are, right? And really, I've been talking about restorative justice, but really, restorative justice is part of a bigger system of restorative practices, one that begins by looking inward, right? And this slide is the restorative practices pyramid, and it begins with tier 0. And that is, the relationships that we cultivate with ourselves, right? How do we see ourselves? Are we able to have a wise adult in the room as we experience conflict? And are we able to tend to ourselves and care for ourselves? And in the preparatory meetings that I have with folks before we bring the parties together, that is the work that we're doing. And this is where so often self-empathy and the skill of learning how to listen carefully for our feelings and needs becomes so critical and important. The next step up is building positive relationships with others. And you can do this whether there's, a serious harm or not. For example, you can have circles in which you celebrate staff members for all of the positive contributions they've made. In the context of a restorative justice process, you can begin by looking at the positive supports the individuals have and learning how to appreciate and honor and use those positive supports as they move through the process. Tier 2 is relationship maintenance. So again, when we're not dealing with serious harm, sometimes we do have difficult feedback that we have to give someone, whether it's a supervisor having to give difficult feedback to a supervisee, or whether it's, a parent having to talk to a child about a difficult matter in which they've engaged. Having intentional strategy around coming alongside that person instead of having power over them really can make a difference in terms of what they learn from that experience. And then finally, tier 3 is restorative justice, where we're handling major harm like racism, sexism, discrimination, harassment, and criminal behavior. Finally, tier 4 is reintegration. How do we come back together after we've had either an investigation and hearing process, or when there's been separation, whether it's incarceration, suspension? How do we come back into community with one another? Moving through these tiers is the way that people can start to do sorry. So as they start to trust, value, honor themselves, their feelings and needs, they can start to extend that learning to others. And by extending that learning to others, and being supported through that process, they can feel empowered um, because their value is preserved, right? They don't have to prove they're not a bad person. They don't have to establish their worth by exerting violence over another person. They can rest in knowing that they are valued, right? And once they have that kind of emotional and physical safety, they can start to hear the way that they have impacted others, and they are motivated to start to do the repair work and make a difference. So, we've been a lot of places today. And to sum up, um, we begin any restorative process with empathy for the person who has been harmed, and empathy for the person who has caused harm. Step two, by naming our feelings and needs and respectfully guessing the feelings and needs of others, we can start to build positive connections between ourselves and another person. Step three, we can start to understand how our needs can get met. We can start to name what could help to get those needs met, and we can get clarity on how to move forward. And then step four is to actually do the repair work, right? It is to do sorry instead of say sorry. And I wanted to clarify um, that concept of doing sorry comes from Danielle Sered's Until We Reckon book. And she explains in that book that unlike punishment, accountability isn't passive. Far from it, she says. It is active, rigorous, and demanding of the responsible person's full humanity. She explains that accountability is not just about being or feeling sorry, it's about a set of actions that demonstrate remorse in practice. And it's not the feeling of remorse that delivers us from our same. It's the practice of accountability in action. It is doing sorry for that person to use their power positively, right? And so that is how we do sorry and complete that step four, the repair work. I would love to work with you if you're struggling through some conflict or working through even how to approach, how to handle conflict. Maybe you would need some conflict coaching, or maybe you'd like help bringing the other person in to have a conversation. You can contact me through my website, www.restorerjs.com, or you can reach me directly at ksvilar@restorerjs.com. I am looking forward to hearing from our next Empathy Month presenter, Cindy McAllister, who is another certified connection practice coach, and she's going to be talking to us about empathy at work. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and love to get in touch with you if you would like to talk more. Thanks so much.